All right, so good afternoon to everyone tuning in from across the United States and from around the world. Welcome to our very first Future of Innovation live podcast event. So we've done a lot of these, but this is the first one we're focusing on specifically on innovation and startups. Today's session features a deep dive into the future of work and AI. Really interesting stuff. I am your host, Brian Antolin, the program manager at LineRun. We're very excited to have three incredibly innovative entrepreneurs joining us this afternoon or this morning to share their insight and perspective on the future of work and AI. They include Dennis Mortensen, co-founder and CEO of x.ai, George Davis, founder and CEO of frame.ai, and Sagi, Eliyahu, CEO and co-founder of Tonkean. So before we get to our conversation, we have a lot to unpack today, a little bit about what we do at LineRun. LineRun is an experiential career and industry education platform for tomorrow's workforce. We empower our community of leaders to connect, innovate, and grow through media, events, and programs such as today's session. We invite you to check out our website, www.linerun.co, to learn more about our podcasts, our classes, and our career accelerator programs. So, LineRun. With that, love to start our one-on-one spotlights with Dennis. So, Dennis, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We'll dive right in. One of the positive effects of the global shutdown is how many people have learned how to take ownership of their time. I think that's one of those really interesting things that come out of this. What role will process automation play in this new normal for companies coordinating business functions? And how do you envision x.ai evolving to meet that future need?
That's a very potent question for where I think there's some sort of 3-hour seminar behind it. But the short version, or a good analogy perhaps, would be one for where anyone could go back into their offer letter and look at what they were hired to do. So we all, or many of us, were hired to do something. You could be in customer success, an account manager, SDR, in recruitment, and the company would have asked you to do X number of things. If you now look at those 8 bullets, and then go back into your inbox and see if you can map any one of those emails to those 8 bullets. In the perfect scenario, in some sort of utopia, each one of the emails in your inbox, if that's some sort of representation of what you're supposed to do, should be mapped to what you were hired to do. That is just not the case. And to put it bluntly, your inbox is just full of shit. And some of them are perhaps not that, but what you're supposed to do. But if you cannot map it back to that, then you should try to figure out, why is it that I either can't delete them or have to participate outside of what I were asked to do? And if I do it, how does that really affect my job? So to then ask, to kind of answer your question, I think plenty of that will need to be automated away. And you can start with the little things, like any one of us come the end of the week or end of the month will need to kind of figure out, how do I get reimbursed for these 4 things which I did? And most people will have some sort of nightmare of doing that on Concur 10 years ago. Perhaps it's slightly nicer today on Expensify, it doesn't matter, but it's just a chore, and probably a chore that should disappear. I'm in a similar category for where we're really just trying to schedule meetings. So the fun part of a meeting is this, like you and me chatting. Figure out that we're supposed to do this on a Thursday at 1 o'clock EST on this particular link with these people. Not so fun, as in, that's just yet another chore. But I think there are plenty of chores that process automation should see disappear. Some of them aren't necessarily complex. Some of them are extremely complex, but I think they will disappear. And I think the kind of current environment that we're in will be a catalyst to see many of them disappear faster than we had imagined.
I love the fact that you brought up equating these processes to chores, and it kind of brings you back to your childhood, right? All the things that you wish you didn't have to do, but you know you have to do, but it becomes a process in order to complete the process. And I think it's that stress built up involving having to actually do the action that actually prevents us from completing the task. And really trying to connect those two using AI in a way that you don't even have to think about that step anymore really will help a lot of people.
There's very little joy as an employee in doing some repetitive task that you can't escape so that you can do your real job. So if you're a sales engineer, I'm sure, or I hope at least, that you love that 2 hour on some whiteboard trying to sketch out some solution with one of your accounts, because that's the fun part. But to do that, there might just be, as we described, 7 chores ahead of it for where you can't get to the fun part if you don't do those 7 chores. And I think many of those chores are extremely repetitive and sometimes simple enough for we can at least imagine us automating them away. I live in the world of just automating away the idea of getting it on the calendar, but that's just 1 out of hundreds that arrive in that inbox. And inbox is obviously just some version of where your chores arrive. And for many of us, that is just the inbox, but that could be anywhere.
Definitely. And I think this provides a really good segue towards, engaging with customers. So enterprises that engage with customers and talking about the process and connecting it back. I think it's safe to say that, companies are approaching their customers and the conversation they're having with customers a bit differently than before, in both tone and purpose, which I think brings us to the work that George is doing with frame.ai. And George, we'll love to loop you in here. We're currently seeing a large scale reset in how businesses build and maintain relationships with their customers. How has data helped to shift these customer engagement strategies during this particular time when everything is kind of haywire because of COVID? And what role will frame.ai play in crafting those conversations moving forward?
It's funny kind of thinking about it as how is data helping shift, and that's definitely one thing that's happening, but in some cases the data is the shift. So we saw Frame fundamentally exists to help companies understand their communication with their customers. So I'll say more about that in a second, but the reason we got obsessed with this is because communication, natural language communication, is kind of the place of last resort for processes to go. So if something goes wrong on your website, if somebody has a new need that wasn't discussed in your marketing, if anything happens that's outside the structured process, communication is the fallback, it's the solution. And you end up hearing about it on surveys or support tickets, et cetera. So when the whole world changes like it does in March, those support teams and account teams that face that communication flow really became ground zero for managing that change. And we saw that in terms among our customers, in total, a 30% growth month over month in the volume of electronic communication between our customers and them. And for many companies, that's kind of started to come back down, but for many, it's just continued to increase because it's completely rewritten workflows and caused new needs for communication between companies and their customers. And I would say for all companies, the nature of their communications with customers have changed. So even if this hasn't been something that generated a lot of traffic, you're now handling types of requests, types of conversations about renewals that are very different in this economic environment and this the various versions of lockdown that we find around the world. So there's been a lot of change management to do on customer support teams in the short term. And what we do, Frame's role in that, we provide customers with what we call operational voice of customer. So we're really focused on this idea that you need to be continuously listening and acting on your customer's voice, not doing it at some monthly or quarterly survey cadence where you roll up a bunch of results and see what needs adjustment. So we've been in a kind of uniquely well suited to help clients roll out operational changes that address particular aspects that are changing about their business and their relationship with customers. So sometimes that's special queues for COVID related billing and cancellation discussions. Sometimes it's diagnosing new friction points. So, you know, if you're needing to cut down costs, where can you do that? What's driving most of the costs of managing your customer communication? And then also just in terms of everybody watching their growth, how do you proactively identify accounts that need special treatment, that need some sort of outreach, and basically handle this as much as possible proactively instead of reactively. So we definitely see this need to help, that listening to the voice of your customer and listening to what's changing in your communication surface is a big part of adapting to an acute change like COVID. But it's also, you know, it's the way things were already headed. So, you know, we're finding that kind of every type of company is becoming a service company. I think one of the themes that you mentioned for this was the everything as a service, which it definitely rings true for us. You know, even sneaker brands are thinking about lifetime value and customer relationships and recurring relationships with their customers rather than just transactional sales and sort of a transactional relationship. And so, you know, if you're starting to invest in relationships with your customers, it was always true that you were going to start needing to talk to them more. You know, communication is sort of the lubrication and understanding what keeps somebody going and engaging with your brand. And so we see a lot of companies, you know, most of you probably work at companies that have been deploying more and more communication channels, help desks, forums, surveys, many more places where people can express themselves. And one of the worst things that we see a lot is that companies implement all of those, but they still have a fragmented experience for the customer because those tools are being implemented by different silos that have their own goals. And the customer, you've essentially shipped your org chart to the customer, and they don't really have an understanding or feeling that their voice is heard across those channels. So we think that it's been an economic necessity for companies to unify that voice of their customer so that they can build the relationships that are becoming their most critical business asset. You know, that's what we're focused on helping companies do. You know, increasingly that's something that's not just owned by support and success teams, but it's something that influences the work of marketing, product, business operations. Pretty much every team has to be a customer-centric team, and that means listening to your customers.
I couldn't agree more. And listening to your customers is such an important and crucial part of just overall success for any venture. But sometimes it's just so difficult for people to actually drill down to do that. And you pointed that out just a few seconds ago. In the process of helping people and your clients try to shift and be agile about how they're reaching customers today in 2020 and where we are right now, what if you had to point out one specific issue that you found across the board that companies have been having, what would that be?
Actually, when you said drill down, that's kind of one of the biggest factors that's missing from most voice of customer programs in companies today. So, you know, the most typical way to approach listening to your customers is to produce structured surveys and send them out and be tracking that and evolve them over time. And not only is that a very long feedback loop, but when you impose a structure on the conversation, you're kind of superimposing, you lose your ability to learn what you don't know. And you also lose a lot of the context for conversations. So what we find is that by generating scores that are based on natural communications that already happened with your customer, and by making sure that any number that you see, any particular score, you can drill down to examples that support that so that they can see it in context, it just makes it much more actionable. Even if the number is right, it's impossible to act on it if you can't contextualize and see specific examples of the types of customer experiences that were leading to that number. And so making sure that that thread stays intact across the various communication channels is probably the single most important thing we do.
I love the fact that you brought up everything really comes back to people and human engagement, right? for as much as we talk about AI and how it's going to transform everything and tech and its place in our lives and how it's growing, it always comes back to how does the tech and how does AI ultimately affect people on a human level. And I think from what happened in the past few months, this interruption of our way of life has underlined that importance of people in the evolution of how we produce, consume, apply, and use technology today across the board. And I think this really brings us to where Sagi is working, and love to loop you in here. In the face of the new normal, many companies are turning to automation to fully take over some of their business processes. But as powerful as these AI powered workflows can be, there's an element of human involvement that's still required in order for the whole process to work. What can companies do to meet those last mile issues in automation, and how's Tonkean thinking about these challenges of keeping humans in the loop?
Yeah, I think actually kudos to you, Brian, of bringing the three of us together. There's an an almost obvious shared understanding of the world that we share and kind of where we think, and I think you touched it. It's about people, but it's also about focus, right? It's I loved how Dennis described the chores, and how you shouldn't do that's not your job description, right? And I love how George is all about if you need to talk to your customers, you need to have the right context. You need to understand like what are the things that matter to them as well. So we 100% believe in that type of things. That technology is really there to empower. People like to talk about automation and AI. Those are fancy words. They're all just type of technology at the end of the day. And to me, technology goes all the way back to a stone, that you use your stone to break the coconut versus your hand. It's all about empowering us as people to do the things that we know how to do better. And it comes tenfold in our mind when it comes to operations as a whole, right? And so how do you enable the business to really orchestrate their processes by enabling focus, right? Like what are the things that the different people needs to be doing, and what are the things that machines needs to do, right? I actually read recently a quote that I was shocked at. It's from Picasso, and he was saying something like, computers are stupid. They can only find answers. And I love that, because finding answers, we grew up on like, oh, if you know the answer, you're the smart kid, right? But that's actually not true anymore necessarily, right? Coming up with questions, on the other hand, that's much more interesting. And so I think being able to focus on one hand, but then have the data and the context to know, the things that you can ask the right questions are critical points. And then where we come in is enable the power users, the operation teams, to really orchestrate the process itself. So we can say this is a task, or this is a point in time that I need a person, and this is a point in time that I need a machine. And that's kind of how we help companies look into leveraging technology better into their processes. I think when you ask about the new normal, there's two things to it. One is the fact that once everything sort of like, it's like pulling the tablecloth under the table thing, everything in one night changed, which I love to see how people adapt to it, right? It's just amazing to see how fast, amazing and scary in a way, right? How fast we move from like, oh my God, to, oh yeah, that's just like how it is right now, right? So the ability to adapt and the ability to quickly adjust the way you do things is something we really believe in and really have seen with our customers as well. Their ability to completely change the way they do, whether it's in customer success, by the way, whether it's, and we have some shared customers, whether it's individual productivity, but sometimes completely redo a process and completely rethink about what are the things that we should focus on right now as a company or as a department. Yeah, I think the future of work and AI is really gonna get a boost on with this Corona situation. I think people reevaluating how they go to work. What it means to start your day and work, and I think that's a great platform. Again, it connects to everything we just talked about, to what is work and what is the stuff that I should do versus the stuff that I shouldn't do, and what are the stuff that the individual level, but also in the company level, if that makes sense.
Definitely makes sense. And I love the fact that you really equated it to asking a very central question of what is work, and trying to redefine that answer for where we are now and where we are going. And something you brought up earlier in your response was talking about focus and how companies need to change or shift how they're focusing. Going to ask you something similar to what I asked George a few minutes ago, but what's been the number one thing or the number one challenge that you've seen across the board in trying to help your clients answer that question?
Yeah, I think it's that priority shift, right? Is that like things that were, third in the list are now first in the list. The things that were first in the list are now 10th in the list. Some industries were more fortunate than others with this situation, obviously, as we all know. But whether you are on the fortunate side or not, everything or many things changed. And how do you move from that sort of shift of priority to immediate action? That's something that requires both data and people. And it's funny because George described change management as well. Like, we're actually sort of our number one value to our customers is minimizing change management by enabling change with minimizing change management. And so we found ourselves in the last few months really handholding a lot of our customers to think through this new paradigm and deploy change in a fast way without forcing use change management on the different parts of the business. And so I think that comes to that sort of agility or adaptiveness we also brought up, and something that is very key to us. We call ourselves an adaptive business operation platform. So adaptiveness is actually very key. So enabling this adaptiveness was, I think, our biggest value and our biggest point of interaction with our customers during this time.
That's great. And I think from what all three of you are saying, it's really showing through with our first poll right now and the results that we're seeing in terms of what people believe we should focus in general on as we really press forward and progress in the future of work. And we see, education policy, changing the way that we think about careers and solutions in commerce, in government, in business, in life. Inclusive job training, very much part of the conversation that we're having as a nation right now. Redesigning work, all of us have mentioned that at least once in the past 15 minutes, and rethinking outcomes, which really brings back Sagi to what you just said on refocusing and rethinking, and how do we really shift asking those questions to where we are going in the economy. So moving forward and really shifting gears a little bit more, George, I'd love to go to you on what are the top 3 trends that you see influencing the future of work based on flexible and remote work arrangements?
I'm actually chuckling at that a little bit because now that he mentioned it, this question of what is work, one of the biggest trends for me is not being able to know where work starts and stops. If you're stuck at home and you have you're kind of in this perpetual work cycle, work and childcare cycle on my side. I think we're all adapting to that, and that's kind of ends up being a more personal challenge, although it's something that companies have to be aware of too. But when I think about the more fundamental changes that I think are going to have a long-term impact, well, the first one that comes to mind is definitely kind of what we're doing now. We're on a Zoom call. This has become our social sphere, and so digital first communications for every function. It's always been a big part of certain kinds of sales, certainly of customer support, which we face a lot of customer facing communication. Those roles were maybe about 50% digital communication. And then internal roles were maybe 20 to 30% digital communication, depending on how companies operate. And now everything has to be digital communication. And so that's causing a massive change in workflows, both for the main stakeholders we spend time with on customer facing teams, but also with other ones. I'd say within the customer facing teams, the big change is that new customer relationships used to get a lot more face-to-face time, and now that's becoming very much more process oriented and for both sides' sake, much more digital. So I'd say that's a giant change, because obviously I think communication is so fundamental to how we work regardless of function. I think related to that, because we are not assuming a shared environment and a shared schedule, we need to orient ourselves around something, right? There needs to be a text that everyone's referencing when they aren't communicating with each other. And that text is the shared data that we have. So I think it's become more important than ever in sort of, if more of your workforce, if the activation energy is higher for people to start coordinating with each other, it's much more important that the data they're coordinating around is well aligned and well consolidated. So I think, every type of company needs to make much bigger investments in the data that supports their individual employees' roles. And then the last one for me is much more human, something I've seen. Our team, we've been doing, we had unusual timing on a recent raise, and so we've been growing the team a lot. I never intended to build a remote company, but we've been growing it in these remote conditions, and so we actually have about half the team now that I haven't met in person. And that's made me think about how important it is to be more intentional about culture and relationships. A lot of things that you take for granted about building a shared culture, and most importantly, trust. And I think that more than anything, both internally and with customers, what defines a company is a set of trust relations between people. Building that up I'm not convinced that it's harder, but it requires a lot more intentionality than it did. We all learned reflexes for kind of developing those relationships in person, and now we have to think hard about how to move them online. So those are the three big ones for me. And I would add that trust aspect is especially important. We're starting this dialogue, or not starting, but we've recently turned our attention to this dialogue about inclusion. Well, this throws a whole nother aspect into what that means and how to be intentionally inclusive when you don't have a shared space to depend on.
Dennis, would also love to hear your thoughts on this.
Let's see if I can channel my inner Gartner analyst and come up with the top 3 trends or something like that. Outside of that, though, given we're all kind of getting older, or sadly I am, so this is my 5th venture, and I've always been extremely adamant that if we are going to make anything work here, we need to meet up at the same whiteboard tomorrow morning, 0800 hours, and nothing else will work. And if you're not here, you're not part of the team, or some other kind of really aggressive version of that. And now, obviously, that is not part of your playbook. So if I were to kind of pick a few things that have surprised me, and I'm not sure they will translate into kind of market trends, but just personal anecdotes, then you can take them for what they are. One is that the definition of a successful employee might have changed. And one of the things that naively all of us, if we go back perhaps a decade, thought of as remote work would be some picture of a guy sitting at home watching Netflix, which is obviously completely ridiculous and silly and doesn't have any relationship with remote work. But there's some sort of, no, you're not. you come here tomorrow. That's why I'm paying you a 6-figure salary. So just stop crying. Now, what I've found though, is that the easiest way to cheat is to just come into the office. If you want to hide, come to the office, because all you really need to do is kind of somewhat arrive on time, stand up a couple of times, walk around, pat a few people on the back, jump into a meeting, be a little bit loud, don't leave too early. And then when we talk about people, yeah, Brian is not too shabby. He's kind of all over the place. But you know what? In a fully remote setting that we're now in, there is no office. There's nobody to pat on the back. There's really only a set of results come the end of the week for where, what did you push to production? And if nothing, and really all you have to show for it is a set of Slack messages, well, what used to be some definition of a successful employee is very different. And I'm not saying my own organization have kind of flipped, but there's certainly a pool of introverts who didn't get the credit that they deserved in the prior setting, who are now just somehow really flourishing in this new environment. And it's become very visible that they are doing really good work. As in, not that we didn't know, but I'm almost surprised, and I shouldn't be, right? It's almost embarrassing that I should have known that before, but now it's just so visible that Joe is fucking killing it. And why didn't I kind of see that before? So that's certainly been a surprise to myself, how easy it was to hide at the office. And I will forever not go back to the whole idea of, if you're not at that whiteboard, you don't exist to me, because that was faulty. I think the second item on that list would be, and I'm sure we're all in the same boat, one for where I thought my processes were stellar. Like, I spent the last many decades, over 4 startups, honing those processes, kind of carrying them over from one venture to the next, and just really, in the most anal of ways, figuring out exactly how to do one or the other thing. You know, how do you onboard a new particular engineer in this particular setting at that moment in their career? And, you know, I really nailed it. Like, oh, you are now on step 7.2 on my career ladder. I know exactly what to do. But in a non-remote setting, many of your processes, if not perfect, aren't fully exposed, because you can overcome faulty processes by just kind of standing up and solve it, or call somebody into a quick meeting. And really all that is you having not put in place, you know, those stellar processes that you thought you put in place, because they get just hidden by the fact that we can immediately overcome them at the office. Now, when we're not in the office, many of those things I thought were really stellar were not as stellar. And we've had to kind of go back and revisit some of them. And we can go back and say, I actually thought we really killed it. I have a CS degree myself, and really took care in making sure that we onboarded engineers well. I think we've done a lot of good work in the last 4 months on how to onboard new engineers versus what we did before when we were at the office. So that whole idea of having to revisit your processes and expose the ones that are not good, it's just positively forced upon you. That I like. Perhaps not so much in the moment when you sit and try to solve something that shouldn't have been a problem to begin with, but on the other side of it, it's kind of very nice to see how you're really cementing those processes. Now, those were kind of 2 anecdotes, and perhaps this is just turning into a mini therapy session for Dennis, but certainly two anecdotes from my own universe. Now, on perhaps the more serious end, I've seen a lust and willingness to take on responsibility for where many people certainly want a level of autonomy in their job, as in they might even have picked that job because of the level of autonomy that came with it, an ability for me to not just be a code monkey, if it is in that kind of, you know, vertical you're in the business, but actually dream up answers to questions that were asked of me, and not just have a set of tasks I need to do come Friday. that I think have accelerated, because many times all I can give you is a little bit of direction and a set of questions where I actually do need you on your own to come up with some of the answers. That doesn't mean that we're not doing any planning or that we're not kind of trying to do the writing that we're supposed to do to ship that feature come that particular date to kind of service these customers, removing whatever pain it might be, but a new level of willingness to do things that you weren't asked to do have certainly arrived, not just inside my own little organization, but also with how we sell our products. So we're kind of one of these bottoms up Slack, Dropbox type companies for where we typically have rogue employees. And I'm saying that in the most positive way. Say a recruiter at Spotify, she started using our tool and she'll schedule the first kind of 50 meetings. Then she'll start using it with some internal colleagues. Then there'll be 5, they'll have a little team, and all of a sudden, hey, I have 17 people using that. Then they speak to somebody else, but it's very kind of bottoms up, but it requires the same level of bravery or autonomy for her to say, you know what? I don't need to ask the director of IT. I'm actually just going to connect or authenticate against my Google account, get up and running, use my own card. I might have it reimbursed. I might not. And then later, upon some success, I'll kind of describe how this became part of our processes. Say, all our kind of step 1 qualifications, I use this x.ai tool. It's going to help us schedule. But they do that ahead of any planning. And that has certainly been a positive as well, in my opinion. So those are my 3 bullets, and perhaps all just for me, but then thank you for listening.
Definitely not just for you, I can tell you that. And just judging by our general reactions, it's something we can all relate to at some level. Sagi, would also love to loop you in here. Anything you'd like to add in terms of trends?
Yeah, I can keep it short. Again, I'm very much agreeing. I actually, quick point is I actually wrote an article about the lack of serendipity that happens due to this change. So I completely agree with you that, standing up in the office and fix it is, or coming up with an idea or the need of brainstorm is somewhat something that I think a lot of people now realizing the impact of not having it, right? But the thing that I actually want to maybe focus a little bit more on, and looking at time too, I think the biggest trend is the change of expectations that it's gonna come out of this. And Dennis actually touched a little bit about that too, of like the expectation he had from his top engineers of what that is. But I think you can actually zoom out and think about it across everything. And I think I saw the result of the prop poll, and also people talked about education. How do we need to change education to meet that sort of future of work? And I think a lot of the things that sort of connects a lot of what we talked about is the change of expectations, again, of what work is, but also like, how do we grow a team? What does it mean to grow a team? What does it mean to be a good employee? What does it mean to have a good process? And I think there's a lot of opportunity here, but it does require us to look at some of the fundamentals of what, how we defined success earlier. And so, that's just maybe a summary of everything that has been told here. But I think just as a food for thought, something I spend a lot of time on. How do I used to define what was my expectations in the past, and how I should change those into this new environment.
Sure. And I think I want to, double back on this and talk about concerns people have about AI. So what we're seeing is, correct me if I'm wrong, an acceleration of both the adoption, the acceptance, and the application of AI in different processes and how they ultimately affect the way that we conduct and fulfill our work obligations. But as this adoption grows and evolves, what are the top 2 or 3 concerns that you see with this adoption, and is there any way to mitigate those issues?
It's funny. I didn't plan for it, but expectation is also the answer for that one. I think there's a lack of there is a lack of knowledge, and there's fear, and the media loves fear. And so when people talk about AI or talk about automation or talk about advanced technologies, it's always sort of like marketed in the common media as something that will replace your work, and something that will take jobs away, and something that is only good for reduction of cost, and therefore like I'll need less people if I have this. Where in fact, and again, this is a trend that we've been literally talking about every one of us in this entire thread, is it's actually about leveraging and empowering people to do the more important things. So I think one of the maybe biggest concern or challenges in adopting and adopting innovation in general is that sort of cost of change and the cost of expectations, and understanding like what are the things that this new technology can do, what are the things that this technology should do, and whether I am a leader, whether I am a person in a team, or whether I'm, again, touching on the education piece, whether I'm a student, that trying to understand what it is that I should do. I think hopefully these changes would help people go back to their own core. What are they good at? What gets them excited? What are the things that matters to them? And be able to focus on that, and for us be able to create an environment where we have the room for those people to thrive. Maybe you are a dancer or a performer, right? There's a bunch of things that I need in my company for people to be able to come, in front of 1,000 people and perform. There's a lot of skills that I feel like are underappreciated because we got so used to a specific way of doing things. Maybe this shakeup, with all the negativity that came with it, maybe there's a positive side of it, of re-educating ourselves. What is actually AI? What is actually technology? And how can we, create that change in a positive way? So anyway, biggest challenge for me is lack of education around and knowledge about that.
Lack of education and knowledge are definitely top two things that I could think of. George, is there anything else that you'd like to add in terms of concerns and moving forward and how more people are using AI?
So definitely first just want to second that lack of education knowledge. I actually think of that in that kind of, I guess, is two of my three concerns. Probably the most important one from my mindset is AI is going to change the way we work. And even more than past industrial revolutions, nobody's particularly safe. I mean, if you ask, data scientist is one of the highest paid titles in the Valley, for example, right now. And yet, if you ask what data scientists are doing with their time, an enormous amount of it is data munging and ETL tasks and stuff like that. And guess what? Those are going to go away as we get better at sort of dynamically producing automation that addresses them. And so, everybody's job is going to change significantly. And it doesn't mean that the people and the things that they know and the context that they bring to their workplace become irrelevant, but it means that they have to adapt. And not everybody is set up equally to adapt. Not everybody is educated to adapt or sees adaptation as part of their workflow and so on. So, my most important sort of social prescription for this is that that everybody, leaders in any kind of organization have to be focused on how they can empower the people that work with them to be adaptable, given the certainty of change. The other form is sort of at the more organizational level, right? How do we, what expectations do we have at AI of AI, and what should they be? And this reset that we're experiencing coincides with a little bit of a cyclical, a hype cycle path that we've been on with AI. And so we run into a lot of organizations that, did some experiment 5 or 6 years ago, or 10 or even 10 years ago, and still have that as their baseline. Often as kind of like we didn't get the ROI, but also, just in terms of everything that's involved, what's operationally required. And so much has changed so quickly that but it's not up to companies who are adopting AI to be aware of that. It's really up to the rest of us to be designing solutions that are just obviously valuable on their own merits, right? Today. And so, I think that's something that the industry is in a position to, that's one of the forms of education that the industry is in a position to perform. The last one, is, we mentioned context of inclusion, and I just kind of want to reintroduce this point that the threat of AI creating and reinforcing biases is extremely real, especially using the methods we do now. Frame has benefited from a revolution in natural language understanding. A lot of that is based on the ability to build knowledge out of enormous corpuses of text. Well, guess what? Those texts have ancient biases in them in many cases. And those come out in a number of different ways. And it's really important that, anyone adopting a solution be aware of that and consider the implications of that and consider their own responsibility and make that part of the process of evaluating and adopting things. And it's important for us as an industry to develop practical safeguards around these things so that they can be evaluated. There's a lot of great research done in this area. What we need now is engineering and productization that make it the reality of how AI products work, that they have an ethical context.
Being intentional, being more educated, a lot to unpack, but I think it rings true across the board. Dennis, anything else you'd like to add on top of what Sagi and George have already mentioned in terms of concerns?
I would add a positive note then. Not that these were two negative notes, but I think the positive note is certainly one for where when we speak to enterprise customers, they've come to be way more intimate with the data that they have, or certainly the data which we ask them to share with us, and more deliberate about what they share with who and when, for how long, and having shared it, on the other side, who owns it. Where if I go back not many years, there were a whole different set of conversations or no conversations at all around this. So that provides me some comfort, perhaps just on the latter point you made as well, that the set of products that arrive tomorrow or the day thereafter will not look like the products of yesterday. And some of those biases that got attached, perhaps not by design, just by eagerness to push something to market as quickly as possible, I feel optimistic that we can solve for, both because the customer is asking for it, the customer has some understanding of what is going on, and I think we have some willingness to kind of adapt to that.
For sure. And I also think it's really interesting how, bringing and balancing all of these issues brings to light outcomes and where we have to really start focusing. So bringing back focus again, where do we have to turn our focus to, and how we can improve? And with our second poll, we asked our audience, what is the most important outcome we should focus on regarding the future of work? And we had a tie between talent mobility versus career stagnation, and of course, using and applying data. So George, just want to get your thoughts real quickly on what are we on the right track here in terms of what people are thinking, or is there something else that we're missing?
I saw in the poll, it looks like we got some interesting questions coming in on the Q&A too, by the way, Brian. But what I saw in the poll was, I think a couple of these were highly related, right? Talent mobility and career stagnation are closely related to learning to learn and unlearn and relearn skills. And I think my own bias and full disclosure, before this, I had a stint in digital education, and I'm very excited about the opportunities for technology and for data to improve education. And any of us who are involved in educating a small someone at the moment are probably learning more than we plan to about using digital tools for education. But basically, I think that the right place to invest in mobility and fighting stagnation and complacency is upstream. How can we keep people's ability to develop new skills? How can we invest people in lifelong learning? I think if we get that right and we create better propositions for that, some of the rest will take care of itself.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Sagi, anything you'd like to add?
I think the only thing that we should maybe do more of is the ownership piece of it. So who owns those changes? Who's the person in our team, in our group, in our organization, you know, whether it's a soccer team or whether it's a company, it doesn't matter. Like, who's the person that owns sort of that adaptiveness? I think when you think about diversity, and inclusion and stuff like that, which are extremely important, a completely different topic, but you know, I think we grew into a place where we know the importance of it enough that we assign resources to think about it, right? And I wish that you know, using those changes that happens with the global economy and Corona, obviously, we'll continue to invest in, you know, who are the people in our organization that care about, and their job description is managing that change, educate internally and externally, and really trying to bring those things up on every day. And you know, not to be political at all, but you know, take that outside of private companies as well into society, right? Like, who owns that change in society? You know, how do we drive this in a way that actually, you know, we actually again focus on the things that matter, right? It's so hard to do naturally without like some guidance. So that's sort of my wish into where we'll as a society focus more on.
For sure. And Dennis, before we get to you, we had a question from Kelly about how with this new balance and paradigm shift with how employers and employees are interacting at work, how do we provide balance for colleagues who are better at the verbal or the auditory communication versus the remote? So we'd love to get your thoughts on this as well.
Here's an idea, and perhaps not a good answer, but it's still an idea. The future might not be one for where the employee will have this kind of very traditional employee status of needing to do these 7 tasks that we started talking about an hour ago. Perhaps the future is one where every employee is a manager, and she is a manager of a dozen or so agents. Most of those agents will be machine agents. Sometimes you'll be a team lead and some of the agents will be human. But many times, and for the most part, most of those agents will be machine driven. And a machine driven agent could be anything as naive and simple as the agent that we put into the universe helping you schedule meetings. But there'll be many other agents trying to help you do many other things. So when you go actually apply for a job, perhaps you're being interviewed not on just your skill set, but your ability to both go find, train, and run a set of agents, many of them machines. And if you come in blank, it might even seem slightly eccentric, as in, so you're going to do all that shit yourself, Dennis? That seems not right. As in, I'm not sure I'm willing to pay you for that. As in, you need to come armed with this little mini kind of staff behind you. And you know, that can sound like some far distant version of the future, but perhaps it isn't. As in, the future just arrives much faster than we imagine. It's not tomorrow, it's not next year, but I actually do think there'll be some requirement for you to be able to do some version of what I described.
Definitely makes a lot of sense to me.
I would claim we already do that, right? The tools that we're using are the tools. You know, if you're good with it, go back to the stone. If you're good with your stone, you know, that's what you're actually doing versus have a very strong hand. But yeah, I agree. Sorry, Brian.
There's I have an anecdote about that, Dennis. And I agree with you, Sagi. I I think that's kind of the natural evolution of tool use. And like all tools, it's being adopted by the younger earlier. I'm now deep enough in my career that when I'm hire somebody who's in their mid-20s, I'm struck by how differently what the different set of skills they grew up with. And so we had a new employee join recently who, on week 2 in the job, told me that they'd used Fiverr to hire somebody to help them do something. I asked them to do it in a spreadsheet. And at first I was like, well, I thought you were going to do that. And then I was like, I'm so glad you didn't do that. It's such a good idea that you did that. And I wouldn't have thought of that. And how do I hire more people who think about that? So I'm going to make that anecdote my swan song, since I unfortunately have had a hard stop, but I'm sad to be just exiting the conversation. Terrific to be connected here with Sagi and Dennis. Thank you guys both. And thank you, Brian, for setting this up.
Definitely. I really appreciate you joining us, George, for the conversation. Really, really thank you, and incredible insights.
Take care, everybody.
So as we start wrapping up, Sagi, I know that you had some more thoughts on the matter. Anything else you'd like to add before we get to Kelly's other question?
I think we can continue to Kelly's other question, because I actually think it's somewhat relevant. I don't know if you want to read it first.
Sure. Kelly is referencing how again, talking about the human aspect of employment, childcare, and how do you draw the lines, and what role does an employer have in trying to assist employees, folks on the team, on trying to create these types of boundaries and support them in this new kind of unknown work situation?
I think the positive outcome, and one of the positives outcome in my mind, and I'm also a father, the abstraction of work, as we talked about in the change of it, actually created all of us, working. All of us are work from home parents, or people now, and parents if you are a parent, and the divide is naturally, at least in my case, became 50-50. There's nothing.
Sagi? Okay, looks like we may have some connection issues. Dennis, do you want to jump in while we wait for Sagi?
Yeah.
Oh, are you back? Okay.
I'm back.
Do you want to continue?
Yeah, sorry, I don't know where you lost me, but basically, both parents are working from home, and so the divide sort of like 50-50, and so at least in my case, but I think in many cases it's sort of actually just put a sort of black mirror into everyone's faces, like this is just the reality of it. This is the bunch of things that you now need to consolidate. And I think all three of us are in a position to try to build innovation that enable, again, we're going back to that, people spending time on the important stuff. And if you use Fiverr, like the George example, or if you don't schedule your meeting yourself, and you have x.ai to do that, or you use Tonkean to take a lot of the load from coordination and operational low value work, you actually spend less time working, producing more value. Less time working means more time with the kids. It means more flexibility in your work. It doesn't have to be like 9 to 5, right? And this is are all very positive things to me. And it's going back to the ownership and the focus as well. Like, how do we now streamline that? That's a harder question and bigger question. It requires a lot of leaders in all different places to basically carry that torch of this is important. The childcare divide and the way we use our time more equally across gender or any other diversity matters a lot. That's sort of not up to me only, it's up to all of us. But I think there's an opportunity, very unique opportunity to push to those topics.
Dennis, anything you want to add to Sagi's thought on how AI is making it so that we have more time to spend on other things aside from work?
Here's perhaps controversial statement. I'm not sure I'm immediately sold on this dramatic divide between work and life and statements such as work-life balance. And anybody who tells me that either I'm out of sync or a friend of theirs is out of sync somehow tells me another story, which is that you must either have a life which is not going according to plan so that you can spend more time at work, or vice versa. Somehow I wish I lived a life for where what I did was so exciting that I didn't have to kind of define whether is this now my life or my work. But that doesn't suggest I should spend 80 hours at work every week. So I'm European. Once I hit that 42nd hour, I'm already stressed, right? So there's that part of the story. And I attended my daughter's 20th birthday this morning. So I'm on the other side of what you just described. I have very little responsibility on what she's working on right now. I just get the stories. But the kind of real point I would like to make is, where does the employer kind of sit in this, and where does the employee sit in it? My hope really is one for where it used to be that the employer had very strict guidelines and were an active participant, as in, here's the address, here are the hours, and there's no cheating on that. Now we're almost seeing the opposite, which is there is no address, or you pick your own address. There are no hours, you pick your own hours. There's a set of jobs that needs to get done. And I almost wish that the employer disappears so that it becomes you and me who now get to design exactly how we would like to design it. That, of course, I think initially might lead to some inability to do a good design, or even some abuse, but I think that will be short-lived. And then we'll get out on the other side, and you and me will have our own distinct designs where, hey, I'm at the other end of that whole child thing because my daughters are kind of 18 and 20, but there's certainly a different design that would apply 10 years ago, and a completely different design that would apply 19 years ago. So I want to evolve that design so that my life kind of fits best into that environment. But I wish, or would hope, that it becomes my design. What I don't think we have is a set of good best practices. As in, okay, at this kind of moment in my life, what are the best practices I should go kind of latch onto and deploy? That, I think, is going to be reasonably chaotic over the next number of years. But I do just positively hope that we'll end up half a decade from now with it being all my responsibility, and then me being able to latch onto some of those designs. And I like the 50-50 design. That's the way it should be.
I think that's a great way to leave off our conversation today with, forward thinking and really challenging us to how can we push forward, not just as organizations, but as people, and really bring in this whole feedback loop back to the start. So Sagi, Dennis, really can't thank you both enough for joining us, spending the last hour with us, sharing all this incredible insight, a really incredible conversation. And again, can't thank you enough for doing this. I really appreciate it. Thank you to our audience who's watching live and also who will be watching this on tape. Really appreciate the time. Hope that you were able to learn some good things from our speakers today and really get the ball rolling on where future work is heading towards and how that affects us as people. Really quick before we end, for those of you who are new to us, linerun.co/events. We have incredible events coming up in the next 6 weeks. Normally August is when everyone goes on vacation, but for some reason we got all these people to talk in August. So yay us. Next Tuesday, we are focusing on LA Tech. We have some real power players there. Check it out. After that, we're going to Silicon Valley. Somehow we're going to end up in Silicon Valley in September, and it's going to be a lot of fun. We just finished talking about the future of work. next month, we're talking about smart cities. So mobility, electricity, how the power grid and traffic work together and how that's transforming the way that we live. Really incredible event there, followed by data. And then we have UX and design in the middle of August and the future of machine learning. So really timely events. Those of you who are interested, check it out. It is linerun.co/events. So with that, thank you all again for joining. Sagi, Dennis, no words. This has been awesome. So
Thanks so much for having us. Appreciate
definitely.
Thanks, Brian.
For those, also, we will follow up with a recording pending Zoom. Zoom's been good to us so far. Hopefully it'll be good to us in post-production. But until then, have a good afternoon and thank you.
Cheers, guys.